Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here. After the popularity of last week's video covering Final Fight, I decided that I would cover some of the game's contemporaries. So I made the decision that if I am going to do this, I may as well start out with looking at the history of one of the most beloved beat-em-up series in all of gaming history. Streets of Rage was an important part of the 16-bit era, so we are going to go right back to the birth of this franchise and take a look at the story of the very first entry in the series. As good as this game is, was it even better than Capcom's Final Fight game that was released in the arcades? Well, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Streets of Rage, and a look at whether it is better than Final Fight. Yeah. The year is 1990, and we're at the dawn of the 16-bit console wars. The Mega Drive is a fairly new system, first seen release in Japan of 1988. We are not yet at the point in time where Sega have become particularly popular, and the system is still being outsold by both the Nintendo Famicom and PC Engine, placing Sega in third place in the console wars. These systems are not the only problem for Sega though, as the same year would also see the release of the Super Famicom, Nintendo's very own 16-bit console, putting further pressure on the gaming company. So Sega would have to soon innovate to be competitive. Amongst the Super Nintendo's early library was a home port of the popular game Final Fight, an arcade game that had previously received Game of the Year awards for its overall quality. As mentioned in last week's video covering the game, Final Fight was a beautiful title for 1989 and somewhat of a technical marvel that had built on and improved on everything that Taito had achieved with their Double Dragon 2 game previously. The title that played the largest influencing factor in the game's development. Final Fight is and was one of the greatest arcade games ever made. For Nintendo, getting a title that carried such name value on the Super Nintendo was a huge win for the company, but the port had a lot of flaws. Most notably, far less enemies on the screen, missing areas, less playable characters, but shockingly of all, no two-player co-op mode. A feature that was possibly most alluring of all when it came to playing Final Fight in the arcades. As all of this was going on, Sega were taking note. The company were already no strangers to the beat-em-up genre and had seen success with the release of Golden Axe. Golden Axe had released in 1989 in the arcades, the same year that Final Fight had arrived, and the game had even been ported over to the Sega Mega Drive that same year too. The arrival of Golden Axe on a home console would be much smoother than that of Final Fight, and the title on a home system was much more faithful to the game found in the arcades. Most importantly, all the game's two-player cooperative play features remained intact, which, as stated earlier, is a fundamentally important feature of a game of this nature. Golden Axe was a hugely popular game set in a Conan the Barbarian style high fantasy medieval world. However, obviously, stylistically very different to Final Fight, a game that had a very different feel to it, which was arguably even cooler looking than Golden Axe. So, in a quest to release a Final Fight style game of their very own, and one that would actually allow cooperative play on a home system, Sega would task Team Shinobi, the people behind the very gritty Revenge of Shinobi game, with making a new beat-em-up that would use the Golden Axe engine, yet stylistically look more like Final Fight. Streets of Rage would first see release in Japan in August of 1991, under the title of Bare Knuckle. The game would be published by Sega and directed by Noriyoshi Oba, the same man who headed the Super Shinobi series and had previously worked as a planner on Wonder Boy in Monsterland. Bare Knuckle was a game that had been made bespoke for the Sega Mega Drive system. This meant that the game ran perfectly on the hardware, and two-player cooperative play functioned well. In fact, the game could be experienced in the arcade too anyway, via the Sega Megatech system, the arcade unit that featured 8 internal cartridge slots, allowing the arcade operators to change what games were available to play. Streets of Rage was one of the games made available for this unit, and like other titles on the system, played exactly the same as at home. The only real change with the arcade version of the title was it provided additional data for the top screen of the Megatech units, which displayed the system's menu. But in terms of Streets of Rage, or bare knuckle history, the arcade release of the game is a mere footnote, and it is the Mega Drive version that changed home console gaming forever. The game opens up with a Star Wars-esque opening scroll, giving you the game's basic story. The write-up is laid over images of skyscrapers that are being panned across in the background. This straightaway gives you an indication of the game setting. Upon reading the text, you will probably notice the plot shares similarities with Final Fight. In the game is set in a dangerous city overrun and controlled by crime syndicates. This time though, you play as a group of police officers who have sworn to clean up this crap hole. The game's opening text reads they are willing to risk anything to achieve this, even their lives. When playing Streets of Rage, the influence of its predecessors and contemporaries could not be more clear. Like in Golden Axe, which had seen release just 2 years prior, you control characters as you fight your way through various stages, with enemies appearing from both sides as well as other locations. This game very much follows the established arcade beat-em-up formula. Stylistically, you will instantly notice that Streets of Rage very much achieved its goals of looking and playing similar to Final Fight, and we will discuss more about the mechanics and level design shortly. Once again, like Final Fight, the game starts out by prompting you to pick one of 3 characters, each of which have their own unique set of varying attributes. The 3 characters as mentioned are all police officers in their early 20s, although each is set to be a master of a different fighting technique. The black guy, Adam Hunter, is a boxer, the white guy, Axel Stone, is a martial artist, and Blaze the Girl is a specialist judo expert. More important than their fighting styles though is how the game lays out their attributes. Blaze is good at jumping and possesses speed but lacks power. Adam is powerful and can jump high but lacks speed, whereas Axel is fast and powerful but no good at jumping. I would say that this is a great reference to this movie, however sadly Streets of Rage predates it by a year. Ultimately, no character in my opinion is better than the other, and it just comes down to personal preference with which one you choose to play as. In terms of controlling these characters, Streets of Rage takes advantages of the Mega Drive's early 3-button controller. Many players will start out the game by hitting A, which is the character's special move that simply serves as a screen nuke. The B button is for attacking and the C button is for jumping. If you take the A button for the screen nuking out of the equation, the control schemes, like the game's visuals, is once again very similar to Final Fight, with all moves being executable via the use of the 2 buttons on the controller's directional pad. Each of the 3 characters have a simple base strike and attack, which is achieved simply by tapping the attack button, and combos can be performed when this button is tapped 4 times consecutively. Jumping attacks are performable when hitting the attack button in midair, and rear attacks are possible when hitting the jump and attack button simultaneously. Grappling and rear throws are also possible via hitting the attack button whilst holding down a directional pad. Grappling combos can also be achieved by hitting the attack button consecutively whilst grappling. As you may notice thus far, all of this is very Final Fighty, although the game builds on established mechanisms further by implementing even more tactical manoeuvres into the mix. More reversals are possible when an enemy grabs you, and you can even land safely when thrown if you press up at the correct time prior to landing. Changes do not simply end here though, because as mentioned, unlike Final Fight on the Super Nintendo, Streets of Rage offers 2-player cooperative play, much like Final Fight's original arcade outing. This home console game though enhances cooperation further, as team attacks are executable in this one. This includes the ability to hold an enemy in place whilst your teammate pummels them, and the ability to vault over others on the playing field. So, looking at the controls and basic gameplay structure so far, although very much built on Final Fight, Sega's game was a lot more than a simple copy and paste of a successful game, and they added many mechanics to make the game arguably even better than the 1989 classic, and leagues ahead of the Super Nintendo port. Now, moving on to the game's stages, the player, or players in many cases, must make their way fighting through 8 stages, known as rounds in this game, another trope taken directly from Final Fight. Like in other beat-em-ups, there is an assortment of different reoccurring enemies to take down, each of which feature different attacks and movement patterns. Apart from using your arsenals of moves to take these down, once again like in Double Dragon and Final Fight, weapons can be picked up and used in order to inflict extra damage. Amongst the items located on stage floors are also objects that allow us to replenish health, repeat special attacks, and even gain extra lives. Within these stages, or rounds as the games like to call them, the character sprites look graphically very different from those found within Final Fight. These sprites in Streets of Rage appear to be smaller and offer less detail than those found in the Capcom Classic. A case could be argued though that their smaller in scale nature allows them more range of movement across the game screen. If Axel & Co were inflated to Hager & Company's size though, they would look very pixelated and inferior indeed. But all in all, Sega did an awesome job with their sprites for such an early Mega Drive title back when developers were still learning how to get the best out of the hardware. The first round of the game takes place late at night in a neon light laden street. Whilst the game was released in 1991, the opening stage reeks of 80s glory and looks like the sort of backdrop we would associate with the period today. Modern homage to 80s martial arts movies, such as the short film Kung Fury for example, draw upon this sort of aesthetic. Speaking of this art direction, it was famously used in the 1984 film Streets of Fire, a movie that is cited to have served as some of the inspiration for the story and gameplay found within both Double Dragon 2 and Final Fight, so it appears that Streets of Rage has gone one step further with this inspiration by including stages that look even more similar to the film, and even going as far as to have a very similar name. If you want to see a movie that looks to have heavily influenced an entire video game genre, then watch Streets of Fire. Moving through to round 2, this trend continues. In fact, the second stage looks remarkably similar to the first stage found in Final Fight, a stage where you walk past multiple dilapidated looking buildings. Round 3 is also similar to a Final Fight stage, featuring your characters walking past multiple palm trees with a city backdrop behind. Some of the enemies even look similar too, including this dominatrix looking whip wielding sprite who looks remarkably similar to Poison. Round 4 once again looks very Final Fight, a stage featuring a waterfront in the evening with the lit up city in the background. In some ways the games are so similar it almost borders on plagiarism. I guess at least the characters are walking across a bridge this time. Round 5 takes place on a boat. Although not a stage copied from Final Fight, stage design is very similar to the train stage found within that game. Both stages focus on fast scrolling through the vehicle windows to emphasise movement, and both stages see the ground itself moving to illustrate motion even further. It is interesting at how similar the design of these two games are. Round 6 is a construction-y sort of area, with multiple obstacles across the level, which is once again also featured in Final Fight. Round 7 starts out in a lift, again a Final Fight feature, before making your way through to round 8, a Trump Tower like posh building featuring gold pillows, once again just like in Final Fight. Basically, until I made 2 videos one after the other on these 2 games, I never truly realised how similar they were, as I had never looked at them back to back before. But I am really shocked at how similar most of the stages seem to look. Once again, like Final Fight, a phrase I am getting tired of using in this video, most of the stages each have their own unique, disproportionately large boss, each with their own attack pattern that must be memorised and mastered in order to easily beat. The final boss fight is unique as the game offers multiple endings based on whether or not you or your partner choose to join him. In fact, if you make opposite choices, then you even have the opportunity to fight each other about your opposing views. The multiple different scenarios that can play out at the end of this game was a fairly fresh and innovative concept for the time, particularly for a game in the beat 'em up genre. Once again, a little cherry on top that makes Streets of Rage such a special little game. On release, this game was universally praised by journalists and well received everywhere as a result. Megatech Magazine's review said it had excellent sprites, backdrops and brilliant music. Add in great gameplay and simultaneous two-player action and you've got an essential buy. Later down the line, Mega placed the game at number 6 in its top Mega Drive games of all time list, illustrating this title's lasting appeal. Past this point, the Mega Drive would not be the only system to receive this game, and the following year of 1992 would see Streets of Rage arriving on a handheld system. This Game Gear version of the game would, as expected, be extremely scaled back on the simple 8-bit hardware, and as a result would only feature 5 out of the 8 original rounds. Further cuts were made when poor Adam was axed from the game, reducing the play choice down to just Axel and Blaze. As expected with a handheld entry, the graphics had been scaled down to suit a handheld system, but still looked leaps and bounds visually more pleasing than anything that ever arrived on the Game Boy. Due to this title being on the Game Gear, 2-player cooperative play is no longer possible, but all in all, I would not be complaining about this title if I picked it up for a handheld in 1992. Sega did quite a good job really. The game would be ported again in 1993, this time over to Sega's 8-bit home console, the Sega Master System. Quite a funny move really, as this would be like Nintendo deciding to bring Mario Odyssey out on the Wii U, but several years after the Switch launch. But I guess the 90s was a different time. The Sega Master System was still extremely popular in Brazil at this point and had large audiences in Europe and Australia too, so it just made sense to put this big IP on the popular 8-bit platform. Whilst architecturally the Master System and the Game Gear are very similar, surprisingly this game is a completely different port, which is much closer to the Mega Drive version. Streets of Rage for the Master System features all 8 stages, all 3 playable characters, and as you can see was ported in a cracking effort on such simplistic hardware. You simply would not find a game on the NES that looks this good. It is just a shame that this bright polished entry does not seem to feature cooperative play. But all in all, Sega opened up the Streets of Rage franchise to a larger audience than simply their 16-bit Mega Drive market. These 8-bit versions of the game are much more impressive than all of the 8-bit microcomputer ports of Final Fight, but I guess this illustrates the quality differences between games published by Sega and those by US Gold. Yuck. So now to answer the big question posed in the thumbnail and the start of this video, is the first Streets of Rage game better than the Final Fight arcade game? Let me summarise my findings from looking at these two games back to back. Streets of Rage very clearly took a lot of influence from the Capcom game. In fact, in terms of level design, you could argue that Sega even took liberties in some ways, as artistically, in some cases, there is very little between the two. But then again, you could say that this is to be expected when both titles seem to have taken art directions from the Streets of Fire movie. But the direct influence of Final Fight itself on Streets of Rage is unquestionable. I think the character models themselves look much cleaner in Final Fight than the newer Streets of Rage title, but then again Capcom's CP1 arcade hardware offers a lot more power than the simple Mega Drive, so considering what Sega were working with, they did an impressive job with their game. Characters can also move faster, which in my opinion gives players a more fluid experience in Streets of Rage than in the slower Final Fight. The smaller sprites also offer a wider movement range around the game's playing field. The soundtrack in Streets of Rage is also objectively better than the music found within Final Fight Arcade, and together with the gameplay creates an impressive experience. The most impressive difference of all though, for me, is how Sega built on the controls found in Final Fight by adding reversals and double team maneuvers into the game. These extra mechanics make the game technically deeper than the Capcom classic, which is extremely impressive when you consider that Sega were working with more limited hardware, especially at the dawn of the 16-bit console era. So, to answer the question I posed, yes, I objectively think that Streets of Rage is better than Final Fight, due to the game's enhanced controls and faster and more fluid gameplay. But at the same time, I realised Streets of Rage would not even exist unless it took influence from the great Capcom game that came before it, and for these reasons Final Fight innovated more in the genre, but Streets of Rage further perfected the formula and for a home console experience. Both of these titles have played an extremely important role in gaming history, and both are remembered fondly today for their huge contributions and innovations they made to gaming. So, with this said, this has been the mad story of Streets of Rage, the game that, in my opinion, is even better than Final Fight. Maybe we'll look at and analyse both of these games' sequels soon too. But for now, I have plenty of other content for you to go back and watch on my channel. I make multiple in-depth videos on gaming history every week, so if you want more like this, do not forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to ensure my content is in your feed. Please leave a comment and let me know whether you agree or disagree with my findings. I would love to hear your thoughts. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout out at the end of these videos. These people make working full time on YouTube just that little bit less scary, so I'd like to thank all of you very much for that. Huge shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, JD Robbins, Since Spaces, Andrew Bazanski, Sobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Daniel Daly, RetroVersion.com, House of a Ted, Dan Barlow Jr., Joel, and all of my other patrons. Yeah! Cheerio.